Okay, there's all kinds of evidence we could gather, but where should we start? Now we know a couple things. One, the engine is very, very lean. The oxygen sensor is down to 4. That's indicating very, very, very lean. Now we also have a misfire, a random misfire. Very easily we could say, well, we got a misfire, maybe we got a bad spark plug or a bad coil. But if the coil or the spark plugs weren't firing, would that create a lean condition? If air and fuel was being pumped into the cylinders, but the spark was not firing because of a plug or a coil, that unburnt fuel would be going out the exhaust, and you'd have a rich condition instead of a lean condition. But we have a lean condition. So at this point, we really can't rule out anything, but the first thing we're not going to look at is ignition. At this point, what we're going to try and do then is look at the things that could cause it to run that lean. 4 millivolts on the oxygen sensor and a 27 on the short-term fuel trim. The oxygen sensor is where you're reporting very, very lean, and the computer through fuel trim is adding lots and lots of fuel. What could cause that? Now we've actually narrowed it down to just O2s and short-term and long-term. So I want to actually look at my O2 sensor and my short-term, sensor 2 and the long-term. The ones I'm primarily looking at right now is the short-term of 27 and my oxygen sensor at 4 millivolts. Now one thing I want to know with the oxygen sensor reading 4 millivolts is whether or not that's truthful, whether or not it's really 4 millivolts. So as you know, we can actually drive an oxygen sensor to report richer or fuel. What we want to do is force that oxygen sensor lean or rich so that we can see if when we are making it do something that is actually reporting good information to us. So how are we going to do that? First thing we're going to do is force it lean. Best place to do that's the brake booster. Now we're going to pop the brake booster loose, and you can see we're creating a major lean leak here. And what's the oxygen sensor reading? It hasn't changed. Now probably the easiest way I like to try and add fuel is propane. Now propane will burn in an engine just like gas will, so you can simply get yourself a propane tank, and they make these nice little devices. But once you actually open the propane tank, then you can control it here, and you can actually open it and let propane come out of here, or close it off. You can vary the amount of propane that you actually inject. So we're going to inject some propane into here. You need a direct intake vacuum source. Probably the easiest one here is the fuel pressure regulator. Now this is actually creating vacuum. You can see that it's creating vacuum. So what I'm going to do is put this in here, and I'm going to open it up and allow propane to go. Now if you watch the meter again, watching the O2 sensor, we're adding fuel, and that oxygen sensor is not seeing it. Now I'm adding enough fuel that you can hear the engine stumbling. It's getting very, very rich, but this oxygen sensor is not reporting it, and the short-term fuel trim is still adding fuel. So we put that vacuum lead back on the fuel pressure regulator. It's a very good way to be able to add fuel to try and force that oxygen sensor rich to see if the oxygen sensor is going to respond. Now to gather a little bit more evidence, what we can do here is actually unplug the oxygen sensor. When we unplug the oxygen sensor, the computer is going to notice that, and it's going to substitute a value of a half a volt. So let's watch the scope when I unplug the oxygen sensor. Now I unplugged the oxygen sensor, and you can see it immediately went to 447, or about a half a volt, and you saw the response there. Now look up here at the short-term fuel trim. It's taking away fuel because now the computer is responding to this half a volt instead of 4 millivolts. Half a volt, same thing would be 500 millivolts. You can see that the long-term fuel trim is adjusting as well. Its number is coming down. Now the long term is a much slower adjustment. To diagnose this problem, you just really need to look at short term. Now with the oxygen sensor unplugged, we can accelerate the engine. And now it has good acceleration. When we plug the oxygen sensor back in, you can see it went down to 0 millivolts, and the short-term fuel trim is adding fuel. It now is reading this as 0 or very low millivolts. It's maxing out, adding all that fuel. So we've road tested, confirmed the complaint, we've looked at all the data, we've gathered evidence, and we found some very clear and convicting evidence that that oxygen sensor is not reporting, even when we try and force it to. So before we can go any further, we got to make sure our sensors are actually working. We're going to replace the oxygen sensor and see what happens. Now we replace the oxygen sensor. We turn the key on, so I'm going to have to reset my parameters, what I want to look for. Now I've got my oxygen sensor. As you can see, it's reading 450 millivolts. Before it was reading 4 millivolts. Short-term fuel trim is 0. Now I'm going to actually turn them into graphs. So my oxygen sensor is reading 450. Now before, if you remember, it was reading 0 to 4. Now this is a plotting graph, so it's going to plot between its high and low. Our minimum is 440, 460, and the maximum, or 447. So it's going to actually plot that. Before it was reading 0 to 4 because that's the only voltage that it was actually plotting. That's all it read. Our short-term fuel trim is 0. Now let's start the car and see what happens. Now you can see our oxygen sensor is beginning to warm up. It's replotting. 447 was still the lowest, but it's gone up as high as 1.007. So now as the heated oxygen sensor begins to warm this oxygen sensor up, it's going to come down. Remember, this is a brand new oxygen sensor installed cold. So now it's going to start switching. The short-term fuel trim is 0. It's going down. It's down to minus 26. So it's going to take a while for the computer to actually see these numbers and start readjusting. But the oxygen sensor should start switching. As the computer sees it, it starts controlling that fuel by raising, getting back closer to 0. Its goal is to stay at 0. It's going to continue to climb. Now if I accelerate this, as you can see, as I accelerate it, my oxygen sensor is switching, and the short-term fuel trim suddenly went to pulling away fuel because I accelerated it. I immediately dumped some fuel in there. Now it's beginning to bring it back up slowly, trying to get it closer to 0. The oxygen sensor was reporting an extremely lean engine, so the computer was adding fuel in an attempt to balance the fuel mixture. This was causing poor fuel mileage, random misfires, and no power. A new oxygen sensor fixed it. The point of this whole video series is to point out the fact that we need evidence. We shouldn't just throw parts at it because we have a hunch. We need to understand the system, get the knowledge, gather the evidence, and let the evidence lead us to the problem.